Now we're going to be talking about supply and demand. Pretty straightforward. Everyone's heard of the term supply and demand. And what's interesting about it is that you've never heard demand and supply. It's always been supply and demand. So with that in mind, remember supply and demand. The ironic thing about it is that we actually start with demand first. Nonetheless, that expression supply demand, it's probably derived from what's termed Say's law. And Say's law, Jean-Baptiste Say was a French economist. I believe he would have been around 1800, probably, maybe a bit before, maybe a bit after. At any rate, so Jean-Baptiste Say, basically what he said was, if you've ever seen the movie The Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, it's probably 25 years old at this point. But the expression was that if you build it, they will come. That's kind of the crux of Say's law. And what Say's law says that supply begets demand, meaning that in order to have demand, you have to have the supply first. And that makes sense. It's kind of one of those chicken or the egg discussions. But at any rate, the reality is that you have to have something out there for people to demand. So you have to dream it up first. You think of like a Steve Jobs from Apple, where you dream up the different things that a cell phone can be used for, right? So prior to the cell phone being people don't even really think about it as a cell phone anymore. It's not really a phone. It's more of it's a handheld computer, and we all know these things. But the reality is that someone actually had to kind of dream this up first. To go beyond even just the phone idea, all the different things that you can do with it, using it as a camera, using it as, again, a computer type of, it's a mini computer. Actually, it's much larger than most computers have ever been in the past. But at any rate, I won't belabor the point. This is, again, Say's law, and this is where we say, supply begets demand. So this is where the expression, I think, why we have the supply before demand. And nonetheless, when we talk about supply and demand, as I said before, we always start with demand first. So keep that in mind. So basically looking at, on the right-hand side, we have what's called a circular flow of real economic activity. And that illustrates, the relationship between the household and the firm. We'll go beyond that, but we'll just start with the household and the firm. So the household consists of all of us. We're all members of the household. And if we look at the way the circular flow flows, starting from in the inner circle, if you will, flowing from the household to the firm, we have what's called the input mix or the resource mix, or the resource or the input mix. And that would include labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and land. And what that means is that labor is pretty straightforward. It's our labor. It's our when we produce something, when we're actually employing our own labor. Capital, it's very interesting. Capital takes on a lot of different forms, and it's in economics, at least in this case, we're referring to physical capital. The physical capital meaning, think about it in terms of like a factory, in terms of the machinery and equipment, robots, and so on and so forth. So does the actual physical capital. There are other types of capital too. There's such things as financial capital. There are other, again, we won't get into at this point, but again, when we're looking at capital, we're referring to that physical capital, that machinery and equipment, if you will. Entrepreneurship, those are the decision makers at the firm. Whether we're talking about a CEO of a multinational company with hundreds of thousands of employees, or if we're talking about a mom and pop place or a owner-operator type of an individual, the entrepreneur function is the decision maker. They're the deciders. They're the decision makers at the firm. And a very, very quick thing that I'll be talking about further. When we talk about the entrepreneur, we think about a CEO. The CEO receives compensation in two manners. One, they receive a paycheck. Okay, and that might be $1, it might be zero, or it might be something. They typically are paid something. But the way that they're actually compensated is typically again through profits from the company. So keep that in mind. There are two hats, if you will. The CEO has the labor hat, where they're given their $1 a year or millions of dollars per year, and they're also being paid in terms of the profitability of the company, measuring that profitability, getting a cut, if you will, some profit sharing, if you will, from their role in the company for making those decisions. Lastly, we have land. Land includes not just the land upon which we walk or plant crops, it's also what's underneath that land, what's underlying the land, whether we're talking about oil or natural gas or coal, or I'm sticking with fossil fuels for the moment, but you get the idea, gold, silver, etc. So those minerals are the other component, the last component. And so that represents the resource or the input mix. So that's flowing from the household to the firm. The firm is what? Demanding those productive resources from the household. Okay, so they're demanding that. And then going to the other side of this, the top part of the circular flow, flowing from the firm back to the household, that's the output mix or the product mix. A lot of different terms for this, but it's pretty straightforward. It's the goods and services that are produced at the firm. And those goods and services are, in fact, the transformation or the transforming of the input mix, that labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and or land that is demanded from the household. So those productive resources are transformed into what? Useful goods and services, and where do they go? Back to the household. Okay, so that's kind of the quick version of this. Also, I have listed down here income distribution. We'll just focus on these three aspects of the circular flow for the moment. So the product or the output mix that's going from the firm to the household, the resource or the input mix that's flowing from the household to the firm, in the form of labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and land. Then the income distribution is the payment back from the firm to the household for the use of those productive resources, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and land. It's broken up into the income itself. Distribution is broken up into wages being paid to labor, interest, which is being paid through. This is where the capital part gets kind of funky, right? So the capital, it also represents the ownership in the firm. So the owners of the corporation, they are the financial backers, if you will, for the firm. With those financial resources, with that financial capital, you're able to do what? Purchase those physical assets, purchase the physical capital. So what's the payment for the use of that would be, it comes in the form of interest and profit. Interest flows through there. It's called a debt instrument, meaning someone from the household, remember the household owns everything when it comes right down to it. And that capital, the underlying part of that physical capital, is the financial capital, and that represents the ownership of that firm. So interest is being paid for debt instruments, which would be like bonds and so on and so forth. So if General Motors, for example, were to need money, you always want to do what? Use other people's money. We do it, firms do it, everybody prefers to do it this way. So again, at any rate, when we're talking about interest, that is the payment back to the household from the firm for the use of that financial capital. Okay, so that's the interest payment. The profit flows back again from the firm to the household for, in the one sense, linking this with the debt. On the equity side, that means the ownership in the firm. Okay, the ownership of the firm is being compensated for profit. Profit would be very straightforward. Profit is equal to revenue minus expense. Excuse me, I had to think about it for half a second. A little longer than that, but anyway, you get the idea. Revenue minus expense. So whatever's left over, the residual, ultimately flows back to the household for the use of their physical capital. For the use of their financial capital embedded in that physical capital. The ownership, they're the owners of the firm. So when we talk about profit, who gets profit? Profit is paid to capital. We just described that. Profit can also be paid to whom? To labor. Labor can get what? Profit sharing. The entrepreneur, will leave land out of it. Let's just focus on entrepreneur for the next part. This is where how the entrepreneur is compensated. And what I mean by that is this is where how it might, here's an example. So there's a new CEO hired, and the share price of stock for the company is at $10. So what we say is that we want, of course, the position to improve. So this is an incentive for the entrepreneur, and we say, okay, in 3 years' time, what we will do, and this is the board getting together, the owners of the company, however you want to characterize it, getting together and saying these are the terms of your contract, and we will allow you to buy 1 million shares of stock at $10 per share. So it's in your best interest as an entrepreneur to do what? Make the share price go up. So increasing the share price from over 3 years from $10 to $30 a share, for example. What that means is that you can come back and buy 1 million shares for $10 million, and you would be getting $20 million in return by selling it at that $30 per share price. So this is how an entrepreneur is compensated. This is that income distribution. And I'll leave it at that. We have much, much more to talk about this, but the idea behind this income distribution as a whole is we have to ask ourselves, do we have an equal income distribution? Certainly not. Do we have what's referred to as an equitable? So equal means everybody gets the same. Equitable income distribution means that you are receiving, for the use of your productive resources, the opportunity cost level of compensation, right? So the next question is, do we have an equitable income distribution? And the answer to that one is also a very loud no, okay? And we know this because some people are compensated much, much more than their opportunity cost level. And that's, you can go through a whole list of people, individuals, etc. But again, we'll talk about that at another time. So when we're talking about, we'll kind of digressing a little bit here, we'll just talk about the different types of economic systems. There basically are 3 or 4, I guess you'd really say, starting with the tribal economy that's based on barter, where there is no money. And there really isn't, there aren't really any tribal economies left in the world. There may be a couple of 2 or 3 that are hanging out there, but it's not to say that there's still not barter. There's barter is always around, trading services for goods, or goods for goods, or services for services. It's just it's what we actually do this on a daily basis, where we're trading. Money does not change hands, right? Anyhow, that's a tribal economy. Command economy would be a communist economy, where back to our circular flow, where the decision making, in particular, the function of the entrepreneur, is performed by the government. So the government dictates what? The government would be dictating how the productive resources would be marshaled, how they would be directed, so far as production is concerned. How people, and people, not just people, but how those productive resources that are being employed, their owners, those productive resources in terms of like labor, and then the owners of those productive resources, the folks that own the physical capital, and so on and so forth, how they are compensated. So they're controlling the income distribution. They're controlling all aspects of this. So this is a communist command control, where they're dictating what productive resources are being employed, how those productive resources are being compensated, what goods and services are being produced at the firm. All right. Do we have command economies? Yeah, we still have North Korea, for example, and Cuba to a lesser extent, I suppose. Nonetheless, there are certainly other countries that were once command economies, such as the former Soviet Union, Russia, they still have some of that embedded in them, if you will. And also, of course, China. China has moved more toward free market. They're not there, of course. They have the Chinese Communist Party, they're the ones that are in control of everything. And when you're talking about a population of 1.4 billion being controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, which is about 90 million people, that's still very much closer to a command economy, if you will, than to a free market economy. So free market economy, if you will. Now back again to our circular flow, we talked about the different components. The different components would be the household in the firm. There's also a government component and then the international component that would be thrown in there as well. So if we're talking about a free market economy, government is not involved, okay? So this would be a laissez-faire, it's a French term, you leave it alone type of an arrangement where government stays out entirely. That's a free market economy. Do we have any free market economies? No, we do not. But that's, again, where government would not be involved. Having said that, this is kind of the fourth, it would be the mixed economy, and that runs the gamut from being relatively close to a command economy like a China, moving away from that toward like the United States, for example. So the mixed economy would be, we'll just say in general, would be more of a free market economy if it leans that way. It would also, but it also includes what? Government stepping in. Those are the mixed economies. Anyhow, the main distinctions, if you will, between a command economy and that of a free market capitalism is that who's making the decisions on all these things? Who's making the decision on what productive resources are being employed, how they're being employed, what is actually being produced at the firm, and who and how are the owners or the participants, if you will, the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land, how are they being compensated? So this is the primary distinction is that command economy that's determined by the government, by the state, if you will. So a socialist system or a communist system, it's all being dictated from the top down, as opposed to free market capitalism, or moving closer to free market capitalism, that's being determined by whom? By the free market, by individuals within that market, making their individual choices, their selections, and acting on their behalf, at least in theory, would be the entrepreneurs. Okay, anyway, so now moving on again, or drilling down perhaps, if you will, on this, and we talk about free market capitalism, what is actually driving that supply and demand relationship? So there's a term, and I'll probably be talking about this a bit more, but I'll bring it up right now, and it's called the invisible hand of competition. So when we talk about supply and demand, that relationship, that invisible hand of competition, it was something that was brought up by Adam Smith. He was kind of the father of modern economics, or at least that's the, we kind of use him as the starting point, and he wrote in 1776, yes, the same year in which we declared our independence in the U.S., right? So the idea behind the invisible hand of competition is that individuals acting in their own self-interest. So if we're talking about entrepreneurs, for example, at the firm, when they're acting in their own self-interest, they cannot help but to act in the best interest of society at large. It doesn't sound like that would be the case. However, if you think about it, it does make sense. Because if you have a business and assuming it's an ongoing business, you want to keep it going, keep it up and running, what do you have to do? You have to take care of your customers. So what happens, for example, we'll just stick with all else equal, it's a term in economics, it's ceteris paribus. So we're holding everything else constant. Again, that's ceteris paribus. That term, we're holding everything constant. We're saying that all we're talking about is price. So everything is the same quality, so on and so forth. So if you have a good or service that you want to sell to somebody, if you want to raise the price, what do people do? If there are other options, they would typically turn to those other options or substitutes. So what we're saying then is that this invisible hand of competition, what happens is that it tends to keep prices down. It tends to, keep firms in line, meaning that they are there to serve the consumer, driving toward that consumer sovereignty. So this is the crux, if you will, of the free market capitalism. What drives it? Does it work all the time? No, and we'll get to that. But in general, it's a crazy system because we're talking about individuals making individual decisions in their own best interest on all sides of the equation, but somehow it works. It's a thing of beauty when it is actually working, but we'll get to that. So when we think about it again in terms of the individual, we're considering that the market is a central dispatcher of those productive resources. So we're moving these things around in the manner in which society wants them moved around. We're employing these productive resources in such a way that they are behaving efficiently. So efficiency means that a lot of different definitions of it, but we'll keep it very, very simple. Efficiency for our purposes, at least at this point, we're saying that efficiency is that the consumer, the household as consumer, remember as receiving those in the product markets, in those goods and services, they're getting the biggest bang for their buck. They're getting the maximum number of goods and services for the lowest possible price. Anyhow, so throughout the course, what we'll be doing is we've already introduced it, but we'll be talking about it further, and that is that government stepping in. The role of government is to, at least in theory, is to protect the consumer, right? And to protect competition, protect that invisible hand, making sure that it works in the manner in which it's supposed to toward those efficient ends, okay? Effective demand. So when we talk about demand, the reality is what? We want all that there is of all that there is and then some. Our desires are endless out there, right? But the reality is that the limiting factor is that what we have to back up that demand. So specifically, we're saying, what financial resources do we have to back up that demand, right? Everybody would like to have a nice new $100,000 plus vehicle, electric, not electric, doesn't matter. We'll just say that with paying for fuel or electricity, whatever you want to say, for the next 3 years, and with no interest payments, no insurance associated with it being prepaid. How many of us would want that? All of us would want that. All of us would take that. But the reality is that the effective part of that demand is the deciding factor. If in fact that fits within our budgets for one, and our desires, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so here's the question: how and why is the quantity demanded inversely or negatively related to the price of a good or service in question? Jumping right into demand, if you will. So if we're looking at demand, we're saying that it behaves in has an inverse relationship, meaning that as price goes up, the quantity demanded of that good or service is reduced or it goes down. Conversely, if the price goes down, we say that the quantity demanded of that good or service increases. And this is all dependent, so we're holding a lot of things constant. So we're saying, again, ceteris paribus, all else equal, meaning that if we're assuming that there are that this is what's called a normal good, and we'll get into what that means in a bit. But these are all goods that we desire. We're desirous of these goods, right? Gasoline, right? Price of gas goes up. Yes, we have got to drive to work, but we think twice about doing what? We think twice about actually taking that little extra trip, driving 500 miles on vacation rather than going to grandma's house, for a week, whatever. Anyways, you get the idea. So this is why we say that the relationship, so far as demand is concerned, typically 99.9% of the time is inversely or negatively related to the price of that good or service in question. Okay. So further on that inverse relationship, the negative relationship associated with the demand curve, the typical demand curve, again slopes downward to the right. And what we have here in our example is we're using oranges. Could be anything, right? Any normal good, and we'll get to that, what that means in a bit. So oranges. So the price of oranges on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the quantity of oranges on the horizontal axis. And the demand curve, again, is sloping downward to the right. So component-wise, we're looking at the demand curve. It's made up of a series of what? Relationship between price and the quantity demanded. So again, as the price goes up, the quantity demanded decreases as we're moving up that demand curve. Conversely, as the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis, the price axis, if you will, as the price drops, goes down, the quantity demanded on the x-axis or the horizontal axis increases. So it moves out to the right, if you will. Anyhow, this is the expression that we use. It's called the law of demand. And the law of demand simply states that as price goes up, the quantity demanded falls. And again, this is the basis for that inverse relationship or negative relationship. So again, just reading through this, the law of demand argues that in almost all cases, with a few fleeting exceptions, when price, and we'll get to that in a bit, that when prices fall, the quantity demanded for that good will increase. Again, ceteris paribus, all else equal. And when the price rises for that good, the quantity demanded for that good will decrease. Again, ceteris paribus, all else equal. Again, when we say the price rises, the quantity demanded is reduced. So again, the price is on the vertical axis. So again, walking through this law of demand for demand curves, so very, very straightforward, right? So we've got the law of demand as price increases, the quantity demanded is reduced. As price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. So if the quantity demand goes up, if the price goes down. Very, very straightforward. Change in quantity demanded, again, law of demand therefore says all demand curves, again with very few exceptions, slope downward to the right. This means, again, as the price falls, the quantity demanded increases, and conversely, as price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. Again, this concept is nearly universal. And what the supporting the support behind this would be what's called the substitution effect and the income effect. So when the price of a good changes, again, let's assume it's rising, while the price of all other goods remain constant. Remember, we're keeping everything else constant. The buyers in that market will begin to opt for those substitute goods. They will opt to substitute for those goods where the price has remained the same. This is again called the substitution effect. We do this all the time. If we see the price of a gallon of milk going up and there are other options that we could buy, and not just the Meyer brand or the Kroger brand or whatever, we would opt for perhaps another brand, if you will. So the more goods more substitutes that are out there that are available, and the more substitutable they are, the greater is that substitution effect. So think about it again in terms of the more options that you have, the more choices that you have to go out there, the better off you are so far as being a consumer is concerned. This is a very, very powerful factor, obviously. So again, as the price of good falls, all other prices remain constant. It's as if that buyer's income increases so they can actually purchase more of the same good. If the good is a normal good, again, normal good is that almost all goods are normal goods, meaning in effect that if you have more income, you're going to buy more of those goods. And whether we're talking about hamburgers or steak, and I know there's a preference for moving from one to the other, but the reality is that both of them are normal goods. So you would see if you had more income, there would be an increase in the purchase of those goods than just in general, we're saying, right? So the income effect also results in what we're saying again is that if the price of another good has gone down, the increase in the purchase of those goods. If the price of a good rises, the income and substitution effects would then reduce the quantity demanded. Hence, again, the law of demand. They both work in concert to reinforce that law of demand, the substitution effect and the income effect. So the substitution effect basically says that the more substitutes that you have, all else equal, the greater is the substitution effect. Likewise, the more income that you have, or the less income that you have, but we'll just stick with the more income that you have, the more normal goods that you'll be purchasing. And if you have less income, you'll be buying less normal goods. But anyways, both of these act in concert to reinforce that law of demand. So again, to reiterate, when we're talking about the substitution effect, what we're saying is that when a price of a good increases, the quantity demanded, all else equal, the quantity demanded decreases due to the availability of substitutes. So long as there are substitutes that are available that are reasonable or highly substitutable, then people will opt to purchase those other goods or services, those substitutes. Again, that's the substitution effect. The income effect, since nearly all goods are normal goods, so 99 and 9/10% of all goods are normal goods, that when the price of those goods for the price rises for those goods, the quantity demanded is reduced. So these are things that both the substitution effect and the income effect are the drivers, if you will, behind that law of demand. They're the ones that reinforce that law of demand. And I'm not sure if I've got this. I'll just put it out here right now. So when we have goods that are not normal goods, that are inferior goods, if you will, what we would say is that the demand curve might behave differently. So a quick example of that is something that's called a Giffen good. Giffen, it was the name of an English British official that was in Ireland in the mid 19th century. So picture in the 1840s, late 1840s, what we had in like 1845. Or thereabouts, and going on for at least a couple of years after that, maybe 2 or 3 years, we had what was called the Irish potato famine. So what happened was that the main source of nutrition for the Irish people were potatoes. And the potatoes, of course, they come from the New World, and they've been in Europe for a while at that point, for a couple hundred years at the very least. And this was a particular strain of potato. I believe it came from Germany. Doesn't matter. The idea was that this potato was a huge part of the food budget for the Irish populace. So the Irish peasant class, which was pretty much all of Ireland, they were highly dependent upon potatoes. Probably 60, 70+% of their food budget it was in potatoes. Potatoes are highly nutritious, a lot of starch, calories, so on and so forth, enough to keep you alive. And they lasted a long time. You could store them for a very long time, especially in a dark atmosphere. And Ireland, of course, had lots of that. It's a pretty rainy place where it's lots of cloud cover, but it would be stored like in a cellar. So the idea again is that they were great foodstuff for the Irish peasant class, and most all of Ireland were peasants. So at any rate, what happened was, it was termed again the potato famine, was that this potato that they were highly dependent upon and was a great food source and lasted a long time, were able to store for long periods of time, they started going bad overnight. So there was some sort of infestation, some sort of a virus or whatnot in the potatoes, and it turned the potatoes pretty much like an overnight scenario, situation where they went bad, where they turned into mush, so they were no longer edible. So of course, what happened was that as more and more of the potato crop, the availability of the potatoes started to fall, the price went up for those potatoes. But the reality was, since this was a closed environment, if you will, people were forced to do what? To buy more potatoes. They had no other choice. There was no other food source available for them. So as the price went up, the quantity demanded also increased. So we had a demand curve that is sloping upward to the right. So looking like a supply curve, which we'll get to that in a bit. So anyway, this is like the one instance, and there was argument that this never really was the case, but you can see how this could be considered a situation where the normal would not behave as a normal good, and it would be it would therefore violate, if you will, or go against the law of demand, that negative inverse relationship sloping downward to the right, because in fact you could see how it could be sloping upward to the right. People had no choice but to buy whatever potatoes were available. And this, of course, resulted in starvation and mass emigration from Ireland as a result. Anyway, that's an example. So this is last thing we'll look at is we're showing what a demand curve. We're looking at individual demand curves, and the way we come up with a market demand curve is that we add the individual demand curves together. Simple as that. So prices are pretty constant, or they're pretty regular, going from $1 up to $3. And the more quantity that you're adding, the further to the right we move so far as the x-axis or the horizontal axis is concerned. And this also has a tendency to do what? To flatten out that demand curve. So if we have just one demand curve, it's pretty steep. Another demand curve might be steep. Another one might be steep as well. But when we combine them together, it turns out to be, so far as the market is concerned, a much flatter demand curve. And that is something that we'll be talking about as we go forward. But the takeaway from that is that when we add demand curves together, and that's what we do, we sum them together. We're looking at them horizontally. We're adding to them horizontally. We're adding the quantities, if you will. The y-axis or the price axis doesn't really change, but the x-axis, the horizontal axis, the quantity axis, the quantity demanded axis, that does increase as we add more firms, if you will, or more demand as we go along. Okay, so I'll pick up the pace a little bit here as we walk through. But now we're talking about the difference between a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. We've already pointed out that when we talk about demand, we're looking at the entire demand curve. So we're looking at the entire, moving, that negative relationship, the inverse relationship, whereas price goes down, quantity demanded increases, that movement along that demand curve, as opposed to the entire demand curve itself. So when we talk about demand, it's that entire curve. And if we're talking about the quantity demanded, we're looking at specific points along that demand curve. So again, a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded, or a shift in the entire demand curve versus a movement along a constant demand curve. So change in demand, we're shifting demand, in this case, from D1 to D2. It could be the result of shrinking or less income. So that would result in a decrease in demand. And if you'll notice, when we say a decrease in demand, we're moving the demand curve from, moving it leftward, moving it closer to the origin. The same holds for supply. Decrease in demand, moving slides leftward closer to the axis. An increase in demand moves away from the point of origin, shifts away to the rightward, if you will. So it gets confusing because you start thinking about up and down. The reality is demand going up is actually demand shifting to the right, the entire demand curve, as opposed to that quantity demanded, that change in the quantity demanded, movement along the demand curve. And that's driven by price and price alone. So think about it this way. A change in quantity demanded is driven by a change in price alone, meaning that you're moving along the demand curve, and that's driven by a change in price, as opposed to a shift in demand, which is caused by anything other than just a change in price. Because of course price will change as well, but the others are the driving factors. And in our example, we're talking about increased income. It could be any number of things, right? Okay. So again, we're looking at our example of a movement along the demand curve. That's a change in quantity demanded versus a shift in demand where the entire demand curve moves. So what happens if a factor such as income is not constant but increases? That will again shift the entire demand curve. Shift the entire demand curve. If you have an increase in income, it would shift the entire demand curve where? To the right. And it changed the the actual slope and so on and so forth of that demand curve, but just keep this in mind that if your income increases, it's going to shift your demand curve to the right. And if your income decreases, would be shifting it to the left. So again, what factors can change that demand, cause that demand curve to shift? Lots and lots of things, pretty much anything that's out there, such as we've already mentioned, income. It could be quality. So if you have an increased perception of quality, or in fact have increased quality, that would also so if you've got higher quality goods, all else equal, then people might be enticed to buy more of those. It could shift that demand curve rightward. Advertising, the role of advertising is to do what? To get you to buy something. And we'll get to that more as we kind of go along. But advertising can, again, change that perception, whether we're talking about quality or some other characteristic of that, whatever that item is that we're talking about. Substitutes, of course, that could certainly shift the demand curve. And we saw that specifically when we were talking before about summing up demand curves, to make up a market demand curve. Meaning that the more substitutes that we have, what happens to the demand curve? It flattens out because it increases the quantity of demand at those given prices that have stayed static, if you will. Complements is another term that we'll be getting into. Complements are things that go together. So, for example, if the price of peanut butter goes down, chances are the demand, all else equal, the demand, meaning nothing else has changed, the demand for jelly might increase, okay, or vice versa. If the price of peanut butter goes up, the demand for jelly might decrease. So decrease meaning shifting in demand. Expectations, weather, etc., all the things that come along with it. Again, in defining demand curve, especially effective demand, many, many things come into account, including the income distribution. We already talked about income itself, of course, the age distribution, different preferences, different age groups, right? Life of stock, the actual inventory that you have, product differentiation. The list goes on and on and on. So again, just to reiterate, when we're talking about a shift in demand, we're talking about a change in everything, not just price. So changes in income, population distribution, wealth, the list goes on and on. It causes the demand curve to shift. It's not just a change in the quantity demanded. It's not just movement along the demand curve. It's the actual demand curve itself. So on the right, we're looking at the effect of a change in income on a demand curve, just looking at that as an example. So we're shifting demand. So if your income goes up, then the amount that you're going to be consuming is going to increase. So again, this is just the relationship causing that demand curve to do what? When we say that the demand increases, it's actually doing what? Shifting to the right. Conversely, if your income decreases, consumption is going to go down and the demand is going to be reduced. So what happens then is that demand curve shifts which way? To the left, closer to the origin. Always keep that in mind. Increased demand, it's going to shift to the right, the demand curve. A decrease in demand, it's going to cause that demand curve to shift to the left. Okay, so in this case, kind of drilling down a bit more. So I'll just go ahead with this and explain how an increase in the number of substitutes impacts the demand relationship. Remember before, I just talked about this a couple of times. One, so if you have individual demand curves, they're steep, right? If you just have a few items, it's rather steep. But if you have 3 or 4 of those demand curves and combine them together, it's an additive approach, and we're summing up what? The quantities, the various quantities based on the same price. So we're adding more and more to that. So in effect, what happens is that demand curve flattens out with the more market participants that you have, right? So again, this is the substitution effect, competition and its effect. The more competitors that you have, the more firms that you have participating in this market, the more competitive it's going to be. And it results in what? A flattened demand curve. So in this case, we're shifting that demand curve by adding more market participants shifting from D1 to D2. And the demand curve becomes more price elastic, and we'll get into what that means in a bit. So just think about it this way. When I say elastic, that means sensitive. It's more sensitive. The prices are more sensitive to, the quantity demanded is more sensitive to increases or decreases in prices than would otherwise be the case. So really, this is the driver. This is what drives that invisible hand of competition. So long as you've got adequate competition itself, it's going to do what? Manage to keep prices at bay, keeping them from rising at the very least, and hopefully driving them down even more. The more market participants that you have, the more participants that come in. Flip side of that is advertising. And the role of advertising is to steepen that demand curve, to differentiate yourself, to when we say ceteris paribus, all else equal. No, in this case, we're trying to make ourselves different, right? We're trying to differentiate ourselves from our competition. So in effect, what we're saying is that we're trying to disengage from that market. Really is the objective, so that you could be standing alone, which of course provides you with what? More opportunities to raise prices, right? So in this case, again, we're just going to explain how spending on a promotional product by increasing brand loyalty or differentiating it from other substitutes makes business sense in terms of the demand for a firm's product. The objective is you want to steepen the demand curve, and the reason that you want to do that is that it lessens the impact of price increases. So remember, these are normal goods. Law of demand dictates what? Price goes up, quantity demanded is reduced. What we're saying is that we're looking at two different components. We're looking at price and quantity. Price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Combining the two, price times quantity equals revenue. And all we really care about is revenue. So if we have a price increase, we know that we're going to be reducing quantity, but if we're able to steepen that demand curve, it's not going to be as sensitive to that price increase. And as a result of which, we may end up with, or the objective is to end up with what? More revenue. Okay, so further on that price elasticity of demand, this is a concept that we'll be talking about in greater detail. In fact, we've got a chapter pretty much dedicated to it, and we'll be getting to that later, but this is a little general introduction. So the objective is that we're trying to flatten the demand curve. So we're shifting that. We're trying to either flatten the demand curve in terms of added competition, or we're trying to steepen it if we're looking toward advertising. So when we talk about marketing, the whole objective of marketing is trying to manage that demand curve, trying to steepen that demand curve, make it less price sensitive, less elastic, if you will, or more inelastic. We'll get to that again. So increasing competition rotates the demand curve to a flatter position. Price elasticity, each of those prices increases. Remember, just the sensitivity to the price, that's really what we're saying. So that increases. So when the demand curve shifts to the right, price elasticity decreases with every price, and we'll get to that in a bit. But the idea is that if you shift rightward, that's going to impact the price elasticity at that given price. And again, we will show what we mean by that in a bit. Product differentiation, again, that advertising, it aims to reduce that competition and therefore reduce the impact of that substitution effect. The greater ability to increase revenue with price increases if you're able to do what? To steepen, if you're able to differentiate yourself from your competition. So looking at the actual demand curve itself, and we'll be looking at supply in a similar manner, but so we're just, in this case, all we're doing is we're showing three things. One, illustrating what a demand curve looks like, sloping downward to the right. Two, we've already talked about this verbally, how we've arrived at that. And the third aspect of this is the actual arithmetical piece of it, the math piece of this. So in this case, we're saying QD, quantity demanded, is equal to 40 minus 2P. 40 is the quantity, and the 2P is what we're talking about, what the price is going to be at. So if QD is equal to 40 minus, again, the 2 times 0, where the price is at 0, then what happens is that the x-intercept, where the QD is at 40, is at 0 so far as the price axis is concerned. Conversely, when we're looking at the y-axis, where that demand curve kind of ends up or starts, if you will, on the left or at the price axis, we're saying QD is equal to 40 minus the 2, and we're looking at the y-intercept is at 20, right? So 2 times 20, we're saying the quantity demanded is 0, where the price or the y-intercept is at 20. So this is again, talking through this verbally, looking at it, depicting it, illustrating it, and walking through the math on it. It's pretty straightforward, and it's very powerful, but these are things that again, just to walk through to give you kind of a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about a demand curve itself. So we've already talked about this, but starting fresh, if you will, back to this demand curve. So we're looking at a demand curve where the y-axis is also called the price axis, and the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, is also called the quantity axis, quantity demanded, but quantity axis. We'll just leave it at that. And again, the downward sloping demand curve is again the indicative of a typical demand curve sloping downward to the right. Okay, so underneath, before we said also that revenue is equal to price times quantity, and when we talk about the revenue, that's represented by the graph that's below this demand curve. And what you'll notice with this revenue curve is that it slopes upward, peaks, and moving from left to right, slopes upward from 0, and it peaks at 4, in this case, total revenue, and then it comes back down to 0 on the right-hand side. So this is just a depiction, if you will, of what a demand curve looks like. And the relationship between the demand curve and the associated revenue that goes along with it. So the revenue moving rightward increases to the point where it flattens out, plateaus, and then it comes back down and decreases. So juxtaposed in relationship with that demand curve up above, we're looking at, starting from the top left, if we're doing what? Decreasing prices until we reach, it's on here as the equilibrium price, but that's the midpoint is really what we're saying. We'll get to what that means in a minute, but that's the midpoint of that demand curve. When we reach the midpoint of that demand curve, that's where marginal revenue is at a maximum. Continuing down that demand curve, past that midpoint, what happens to total revenue? Total revenue actually decreases. So keep that in mind, whether we're talking about moving from the y-axis down the demand curve to the x-axis, or vice versa, moving up from the far right on this demand curve back to the top of that, to the y-axis. This is the relationship we're talking about the revenue. Very, very powerful tool, and we'll get into what that means in just a moment here. So in this case, when we're looking at our demand curve, we're moving from what's called the inelastic range to the elastic range. So with our demand curve starting at the x-axis, at the quantity axis, and moving leftward back up to the top where it crosses the price axis on the very top. And remember, the midpoint is where it's the middle point between the bottom or the right of the demand curve, or and the top of the demand curve. So that is right at that midpoint. So on the bottom right-hand side, moving from the x-axis up to that midpoint, it's called the inelastic range. And if you go beyond that, moving from that midpoint up to the y-axis along the demand curve, that is the elastic range. The relationship is that the idea with this price elasticity of demand, this is and I'll read this off, the relationship of price to quantity demand and how it relates to total revenue is technically called the price elasticity of demand. The price elasticity of demand. A demand curve facing a firm that slopes downward to the right indicates the firm has some degree of market power. We'll get into what that means in a minute. A reduction in quantity supplied by the market to the market by the firm will increase the price and may, if the price increases in the elastic range of the firm's demand curve, raise total revenue as well. So the idea is, the takeaway from this is, if you're in the elastic range, moving up to that midpoint, increase in what? Price. Price is going up. What happens to the quantity demand? It's reduced. But all we're really concerned about is what? We're concerned about revenue. Price times quantity is equal to revenue. And what we notice is that, or what we've known from looking at our previous presentation with our demand curve on top of that marginal revenue curve, if we're moving in the inelastic range up toward that midpoint, if we increase prices, even though we're reducing the quantity demanded, versus, via or in line with that law of demand, we are doing what? We're increasing revenue. So we, as good entrepreneurs, runners, the folks that are running the firm, that making the decisions, if we want to increase our profitability or increase our revenue, we raise prices. As opposed to if we are in the elastic range, which is above that midpoint, if we raise prices in that range, what happens to our revenue? It's actually reduced. So if we are in the elastic range to the left of that midpoint, and what we want to do is reduce prices in order to do what? To increase our revenues. So anyhow, and we'll get more into this as we kind of go along. This is just a quick overview of it. The idea is that we're all about what? Maximizing our revenue. So where do we know where we're at? Honestly, we don't. The only way that we can figure this out, you can do all the market analysis that you want, and you can guess and do a bunch of modeling, but the only way you really know is by doing what? Raising prices, increasing prices, or reducing prices. And all you care about is that your revenues are increased. So if you increase prices and your revenues are decreased, you know that you're going in the wrong direction, and you would reduce prices. So this is kind of the takeaway that we're talking about, this relationship. So when we talk about price elasticity of demand, again, the percentage of change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price that caused the change in the quantity demanded, or QD1 minus QD2 divided by QD1, how much that quantity demanded has changed over how much that price has changed. P1 minus P2 divided by P1. So we're looking at these percentage changes really is what we're driving at. So again, once the price of the good is above that midpoint of the demand curve, the coefficient of price elasticity or price elasticity, the ratio of the percentage change in the quantity demanded to the percentage change in the price that caused the change in the quantity demanded becomes less than 1. When that upper range is reached, the price increases now cause total revenue to fall, and the price decreases cause total revenue to rise. The graph again shows these relationships. So in essence, in short, if we are below that midpoint, and I've got it listed here as equilibrium price, but that's the midpoint is what it should be. That midpoint below that to the right, we are in what is called the inelastic range. And if we want to increase revenue, we raise prices. If we are above that midpoint or to the left of that midpoint, going up that demand curve toward the y-axis, toward the vertical axis, toward the price line, in order to increase revenue, what do we have to do? We have to reduce prices. And it shows with that beautiful revenue curve down below, that hump-shaped revenue. This is a really good illustration. And it's critical to entrepreneurs to kind of figure these things out, figure out where they're at. And now, of course, this is always a moving target, because demand curves they don't behave. They're shifting all the time. At any rate, this kind of gives you some idea of what we're talking about when we're saying price elasticity of demand and the behavior of the demand curve and why it's so important. So the meaning of the law of one price and the association or the its relationship with price discrimination. So law of one price, that is there is no price discrimination. It's unless it's completely justified by cost differences. If there's some change in, different pricing for different items, if there's some reason for it, some economic reason, not just because you want to earn more money. Anyway, many political jurisdictions make price discrimination illegal. Such prohibitions have been extended to international trade by trade treaties and enforceable in the court of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Often, price discrimination is masked by product differentiation, and we'll be getting into that. So really what we're saying is that when we're saying the law of one price is that there should be no price discrimination. The only way that you can justify price discrimination is if there is some cost differences that would be associated with whatever the good or service is that you're talking about. So that just wraps up demand. Moving on to supply. So what is the meaning of a firm-supply relationship? Supply curves slope upward to the right, for the most part. We'll get to, there are some exceptions. There is something that's called the backward bending supply curve. But anyhow, sloping to the right, that is due to the expectation of a few different things. One, higher profits. So the expectation that profits are going to increase. So what do? You supply more. It's also driven by higher prices, and assuming that there's an increased there's going to be increases in prices coming down, so it's going to encourage you as the entrepreneur at the firm to do what? To build more, to supply more of those goods and services, right? This provides incentives for companies to increase the quantity of products that they're actually supplying to the market. In reality, however, increased production generally results in higher opportunity cost, bidding away resources from the production of other goods. So, a quick example. So the price of soybeans have gone up significantly, we'll just say, and that's not necessarily the case. Price of soybeans have gone up significantly. The demand, well, we'll just say this, the price, all right? So what that's going to do is that farmers that are producing soybean will continue to produce soybean, but some of those farmers that perhaps were producing corn, were producing corn, may shift their production to what? To soybean. So as a result of which you're taking away from the production of corn, you're producing more soybean. And the more that you're producing of something, the more costly it becomes. Because again, we live in a world of what? Scarcity. We are living in scarcity. And that's really the driver that we're kind of talking about behind this. So again, therefore, as an upward sloping curve is reflective of increased cost, that's our opportunity cost, manifested in higher prices as we move rightward on the supply curve. Simply put, the more goods produced, the more goods that are produced, the higher the opportunity cost and the higher the price that would be associated with that. So the supply curve reflects at least a couple of things. One, increased profits. It's going to encourage increased prices. It's going to encourage increased production because you can get more for your goods, right, that you're selling. But it also is reflective of what? The higher costs that are associated with the increase in production of whatever it is that you are producing. That's the reality. So we already mentioned why the relationship is that the supply curve slopes upward to the right. That's called the positive relationship, meaning as price goes up, quantity supplied increases, right? You're going to be producing more as the price goes up. The reality is that the scarcity of those productive resources and their productivity is something else that lies behind that supply curve. So there's a lot more going on. It's not just the prospect of increased profits, it's also reflecting what? Increased prices, increased costs that are associated with producing whatever it is you're producing. The more limited productive resources, the more, in terms of limited productive resources we employ, the more expensive they become, the higher the price in the market for that particular resource. This is the case with virtually everything. The more quantity supplied, the higher the price, or vice versa. The higher the price, the more quantity supplied. This again holds in almost all cases except for what we term as the backward bending supply curve, and we won't go there now, but this is something odd, and it is the supply curve actually bends back on itself. So again, this is just depicting what a supply curve looks like and looking at it in three different ways. One, illustration. Two, verbally talking through the relationship of sloping upward to the right, the supply curve, and finally mathematically, where in this case we're looking at the x-intercept being trying to determine where that supply curve crosses the x-intercept, or where it crosses the x-axis, where it reaches zero, okay, so far as the price is concerned. So 4p times 20, 4 times 0, 4p, p being the price, minus 20, where price is equal to 0 again. The quantity supplied is negative 20. So, you think, well, there's negative number, but this is just the slope of that supply curve. And also, we're talking about the actual y-axis, or the vertical axis, the price axis. 4 times 5 minus 20, where price is equal to 5. Quantity supplied equals 0 is where the price or the y-intercept is equal to 5. This shows this supply relationship again graphically as we walk through it. Mathematically, illustrated graphically, and also talking through it verbally. Okay, so very similar to, and they're moving in opposite directions, but there's some similarities with the law of demand and the law of supply. So when we talk about law of demand, of course, we talk about change in quantity demanded versus change in demand. In terms of the law of supply, it's very similar. We talk about change in quantity supply versus a change in supply. So change in quantity supply means we're moving along a supply curve, but the price of a good changes, for example, it increases the quantity supplied, increases as a result, and the quantity supplied increases as a result. There's not a change in supply, but rather a change in quantity supply. Again, movement along that supply curve versus the change in supply, where we're talking about, again, in this case, but if the cost of employing productive resources such as labor, land, capital, entrepreneurship, the productive resource involved increases, the firm will supply less units at each price, and this is what is meant by a decrease in supply. The change in the entire supply curve shifts leftward or upward in this case. Or again, remember we talked about a shifting in demand, a shift in demand. Moving leftward is a decrease in demand. Moving rightward is an increase in demand. Very much the same in supply. Moving leftward is a decrease in supply. Moving rightward is an increase in supply. So don't get caught up in the up and down. You can say that supply goes up, but really when you think about it, when you illustrate it illustratively, if you will, we're talking about shifting the supply curve in this case. If we're talking about the supply going up or increasing, we're shifting the supply to the right, okay? Or if we're decreasing supply, we're shifting supply to the left. So some of the factors that are affecting supply, not price, or not price alone, I should say, because prices are always involved, but other than price, change in the cost of those inputs that we talked about. Inputs, again, the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, or land. An increase, a change in the cost, whether it's increase or decrease, if the cost of those inputs increases, supply is going to be going in the opposite direction. It's going to be reduced. Change in the number of competitors. If you have more competitors, what is that going to do? If you have more companies producing something, that's going to do what? It's going to increase the supply of whatever that something is. The change in the size of the actual physical production facility, the physical plant, however you want to characterize it, the reason that you're going to be increasing it, presumably, or ceteris paribus, you're increasing how much you can actually produce within that production facility, so you would be increasing supply. Change in weather, bumper crops versus, where you've got ideal weather conditions, or better than ideal weather conditions, or worse than ideal, or terrible weather conditions, drought, etc. You might have a shortage in terms of crops, right? improvements in technology. And think about it this way. This is one of those things where you talk about, why does a firm implement technology? Why do they use technology? Why do they add physical capital to that production process? Because presumably it's going to be making it more efficient. It's going to be making it more, you're able to produce more with less or the same amount, or produce something more efficiently, period. So that, at least in theory, ceteris paribus, all else equal, improving technology is going to increase your supply. Taxes are a cost. Taxes are a cost to the firm. And so if taxes increase, it's going to do what? Reduce supply. Government subsidies, on the other hand, that would be price guarantees for the corn production or whatnot. That's going to encourage further production. So that's going to increase supply. Whenever you have government subsidies, when government steps in to increase the price of something, it's going to increase the amount that is going to be supplied. Straightforward as that. So now we move to the point where we're bringing supply and demand together finally, right? Supply and demand. So that point at which the market, the nexus where they come together, where they cross, the supply meets the demand, that is called the equilibrium point, okay? So again, the question being, what is the meaning of equilibrium in a market, and what causes shortages, surpluses in that market? So when we talk about that equilibrium point, again, that's where supply meets demand, where supply and demand are at the same price level and the same quantity demanded and quantity supplied level. So where they come together. So we're bringing together the two together, rather, at that equilibrium point in the market. In a market, in this case, we're talking about where suppliers or producers and demanders, consumers, meet, where they come together. And it's the price point at which they are meeting. And also, again, of course, the quantity supply and quantity demanded are equal. Graphically, where the demand and supply curves intersect determines that equilibrium. Quantity, both demanded and supplied, and the equilibrium price. All three of those points kind of come together, if you will. The equilibrium price is the only price at which quantity demanded is equal to its counterpart, quantity supplied. I like to see it again as a point where both sides are, you could say they're both satisfied, but they're both equally dissatisfied, or both equally satisfied, however you want to characterize it, because typically neither side are completely ever satisfied with the price. It's really what it comes down to. This is where we have situations where we have buyer's remorse. All of us have been through this before. Oh my gosh, I paid too much for something, or did I really, really need that type of a thing? So there's always that point, but it is a point where you come together, where you meet for whatever that given price is. It's a price point upon which both sides agree to. So this was just a quick point. Alfred Marshall, a British economist who wrote a book in 1890, it was called The Principles of Economics. And this was the first time that this was formally introduced, that supply and demand relationship. It was called the scissors. It was a Marshallian scissors. And it's where the supply and the demand meet, where they cross. And prior to this presentation by Alfred Marshall, it's not to say there wasn't supply and there wasn't demand. No one had ever brought the two together. And so this was a revolutionary concept idea. Strange as it might sound, it was something that had never really, again, formally been introduced. It's not to say that there weren't markets out there, right, where supply and demand come together and you agree upon a strike price, an equilibrium point, that price, equilibrium price. It's just that it was never formally presented in that manner before Alfred Marshall came along. Very, very important economist. So again, illustrating what we mean by supply and demand, two different things. Three, I guess, again. One is talking to this, again, where that quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, where they are equal, and that point that they share is also the price, same price. So that is that strike price where we have equilibrium, where that equilibrium price and that equilibrium quantity come together, where supply curve crosses that demand curve, where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. All these things that come together. And graphically, and speaking through this verbally and so on and so forth. And then there's a mathematical side where we bring the two together, where we speak to the demand curve, and then we speak to the supply curve, and we bring the two together. So using that demand relationship or equation as described in the questions before, and as we talked about before, and also the supply equations as described previously as well, we solve that equilibrium price and quantity relationship. Okay. Again, very quickly, we saw the demand curve. We talked through this, the graphical aspects of it, the mathematical aspects of it, and the visualization of it. So we're going to bring, first we have the demand curve, and here we have the supply curve. We're going to bring the two of them together, right? So the two of them together is again where we have that strike point, where we have that equilibrium case where at $10 we have the quantity supplied being 20, and we have also the quantity demanded being at 20 as well. Quantity demanded is at 20, and the quantity supplied is at 20, and the price, the strike price being, that equilibrium price being again at $10. So that is the equilibrium point. The equilibrium price is $10, and the equilibrium quantity supplied, quantity demanded would be at 20 units. So onward we go. We're kind of jumping ahead a little bit on this, but we'll just go ahead with it. It's the way I have it presented here. Price floors and price ceilings. Price floor is when we set a price floor, meaning a minimum price, something it cannot fall below that price. So an example of that would be a minimum wage, meaning that you cannot pay someone less than whatever that price is. Other minimum wages, or price floors would be farming subsidies, where you're guaranteed a certain price for X number for per bushel of corn, as opposed to, so those are price floors. There's a minimum set, and it's usually above the equilibrium point. Keep that in mind. In order for it to be effective, it's got to be above that equilibrium point where the market clearing price is at, right? Conversely, we're talking about price ceilings, and those are set below the equilibrium point, or at least theoretically, to be effective price ceiling. They have to be below that equilibrium point. And so where price floors, we typically talk about minimum wage, talk about agricultural subsidies. Price ceilings usually associated with rent control. So rent control, of course, would be where we have where you cannot charge more than this. That's the ceiling aspect of it. So say, for example, the equilibrium price so far as rentals are concerned in a given city are $1,000 per month based on, all else equal, 500 square feet and, so on and so forth. And the equilibrium price is set at $1,000, but the price ceiling is set at $800. So you get the idea. It's set below that equilibrium point for the price ceiling. So at any rate, these are constructs that are put together by government. This is where government steps in. But we're going to step back for just a moment here. So I kind of jumped ahead a little bit with that last bit when we talked about price ceilings and price floors, or vice versa. Price floors and price ceilings. That's government stepping in to reinforce that. But the reality is that when we have market forces at work, and this happens all the time, if the price is, of course, above that equilibrium point, what happens? There tends to be more supplied. If it's a higher price, you're expecting to fetch a higher price for the goods, so you are encouraged to do what? Produce more. And so the idea being then again that when we're talking about just markets behaving not without government involvement, we're looking at surplus. So surplus means that the item is priced too high. So how do we get back to that equilibrium point? Because at that price level, you have a mismatch. You don't have as much demanded because the prices are too high, law of demand. And yet you have more supply because, again, as law of supply, price is higher, then more is going to be supplied. So there's a vast difference between the two, the quantity supplied and quantity demanded. How do we get it back to that equilibrium point? By just adjusting price. So this is where sales come in to effect, to adjust this. So you reduce the price in order to do what? To sell the product that you have. In order to increase the demand, the quantity demanded for that product, and so on and so forth. So this is our relationship. A surplus would be above that equilibrium point. And to clear that surplus, you have to do what? You have to have a sale. You have to reduce prices. So the formal example of that, again, with government stepping in, would be a minimum wage. Minimum wage laws where you set the price above that equilibrium point. So when we're talking about minimum wage, what are we saying? Who's supplying? This is the household supplying their labor. So you're supplying more labor than is going to be demanded at that price. So this is the argument against minimum wages in general, but specifically against minimum wages that are effective minimum wages, meaning that is, if you had a minimum wage set below the equilibrium point, it wouldn't matter. But if you set it above that equilibrium point, of course, there's going to be a surplus of labor provided, supplied, and demand for the labor is going to be reduced. It's not going to be there is not going to be at the same level. It's not going to be at the equilibrium point. Again, this is government reinforced. So there's basically we're putting in place a permanent surplus, a government dictated surplus. Conversely, when we talk about and I guess I should say that the price floor, what we're saying is that, again, that's the minimum wage. I've got these kind of awkwardly placed here, the images, but the idea is that, again, that minimum wage reflects a price floor. It's a surplus, right? But it's government reinforced surplus. The next thing we're going to be looking at are price ceilings, which are placed below the equilibrium point. So it's something that's put in place by government. So again, this is a depiction of rent control, which is a price ceiling. It's in this case we're talking about an effective price ceiling below that equilibrium point. So if the price again is below that equilibrium point, a shortage will result, and as the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So in essence, what we're saying is that yes, the demand is out there for whatever good or service that we're talking about. In this case, we're thinking about it in terms of rent control. There's a demand for rental units at $800, but the equilibrium price is at $1,000, and that's the price where more suppliers are willing to supply, enough to clear the markets is really what we're saying. So you can see the problem that's associated when we're talking about price ceilings and price floors as when they are implemented by government. So again, with the price ceiling, we don't see them much here, and it's pretty much restricted to larger urban areas like New York City, parts of Los Angeles, I think Santa Monica, San Francisco, where you have price ceilings that are put in place. And the problem really comes down to, think about it, put your entrepreneur hat on, and if you're going to be producing apartment buildings, and you do all of your analysis, and you do all of your due diligence on your part, and what you find is that you cannot build an apartment and rent it out at the $800 a month. You have to have $1,000 a month in order to rent that apartment out. So, having said that, if you cannot produce that, if you can't build it and run it or whatever for that $800, you're not going to do it. So this is what happens. You end up with housing shortages as a result. And these are problematic. These are issues that are definite problems on the minimum wage side. If the price is too high, if you put your entrepreneur hat on again, the price for the labor is too high, you're going to find other ways in order to get around to reduce your cost. And it could be, for example, like you've seen like at McDonald's and so on and so forth, you have these kiosks where you walk in and you don't see anybody at the cash register. It is a kiosk where you plug in your information, what it is that you want to buy, and you do your entire transaction without talking to people without dealing with an individual. Anyway, you get the idea. So this is the market clearing process so far as shortages and surpluses are concerned. Shortages, of course, you have to raise the price in order to clear the market, to increase the supply to a sufficient point. You have to have higher prices for producers to supply, to incentivize them to supply. Conversely, when we talk about price floors, when we're talking about surpluses, rather, the way we clear a surplus is through sales by reducing price. So pricing is the mechanism. It is the rationing tool that's involved, right? Okay, so just a few more concepts. One is I wanted to walk through what we mean by downward price rigidity. This is kind of a prelude going into chapter 4 when we talk about market imperfections and we talk about market failures and so on and so forth. So when we say there is not, when there's sufficient competition, there's the ability to reduce prices and to raise prices, and it's much more fluid in that regard. When you don't have as many competitors, that law of, the invisible hand does not operate as well as it ought to. Anyway, in a normal market situation, when products don't sell again, and in terms of those goods and services in the market, this would result in a surplus. In order to clear those markets, firms would typically fall back to the equilibrium level price-wise, so the prices would drop. If the firm rather has market power, they have and do restrict supply. They can reduce supply to maintain the price levels. This is that downward price rigidity, meaning again, rather than allowing the market prices to drop, what you're going to do instead is shift your supply over, so you're creating in essence a new equilibrium point at a higher price level by shifting your supply to the left, by reducing your supply. So under what market conditions is downward price rigidity more likely to occur? Again, it's going to be when their markets are not competitive, when you have a lot of price power, when you have a lot of market power by the firms within that market. So what are the macro effects of such downward price rigidity? It's pretty straightforward, is that this is when you're able to control prices, you're able to, this is going to cause more economic instability. The prices are not going to be able to adjust on their own. So this is, you have increased frequency for recessions. You have increased, there's a bias toward inflation that would be involved as well. If you have market power, you're able to, to control those prices out there much more, to a much greater degree, okay, to a much greater extent. So anyway, on a macro level, the twin biases are toward recession and inflation resulting from downward price rigidity as markets become less competitive. Again, that's that price rigidity, or sticky prices, sticky wages, all these terms that kind of come up, slowly giving way to increasing downward flexibility. This is something that's been pretty common occurrence since the end of World War II rather. So it's a long time, obviously 70 plus years. The idea is that by reducing, by increasing competition, increasing the competitors, increasing that invisible hand, it kind of takes over. So that was the trend. Unfortunately, we're starting to move back more toward non-competitive markets or less than competitive markets, and we'll talk about that as we kind of go forward in the class. So at any rate, this is on the macro level. On the micro level, there's some other situations that occur when we talk about competition, but we'll discuss that later in the class.